If you were to ask the average petrolhead to come up with a brand with really cool cars, Daihatsu probably wouldn't even be in the top 25, if not the top 50 names that they would come up with. And yet, I will unapologetically say that I chose this episode because I love them. We've done some really cool, really obvious brands like Lamborghini, Audi, Volkswagen. With Daihatsu, most of their cars are kind of these small retirement home vibe egg vehicles, if you will, the majority of the time. At least that's what they're known for. Most people don't even realize that they have connections to Toyota, connections to rallying. It was purchased by Toyota, not founded by Toyota, and they have some really cool cars. And of course, if you do want to check out the other episodes of this series, you should slap the link right below in the description to see all of those. And if you do think there are some really cool Daihatsus which I may have missed, then of course you could drop them down in the comments, as always. Kicking us off first of all is a vehicle which you might be familiar with, at least in a certain form, the Daihatsu Charade Dbone. But we're going a step further here. That's already a very rare vehicle. It's around a 120 horsepower, 1.6 16-valve hot hatch, and it was basically made as a tribute to the involvement that Dbone had for a little while with the Daihatsu brand, and it's a pretty cool hot hatch which fetches decent prices here in the UK when you can occasionally find one for sale. But what we're talking about is an even more special version. This is the 926R version, and this was intended for none other than Group B rallying, and specifically being, as its name suggests, a 926cc vehicle, so not exactly the kind of territory you would typically assume from a Group B car. This was a mid-engine 120 horsepower prototype with kind of like a shrunken Lancia S4 sort of vibe to it, which would have decimated the sub 1600cc class. Most of its rivals were more conventional front-wheel drive hatches, and the only reason why this car didn't have its chance to shine, given how Daihatsu is consistently good at rally, it is their main forte, you could argue, is because Group B went away. And unfortunately, what essentially replaced Group B, Group A, required 5,000 road-going versions, which just wasn't on the cards for this car. It's such a shame though, because what a badass little car. The next one goes to the other extreme when it comes to a cool little Daihatsu, in more of a way which will appeal to the Gran Turismo fans, stuff like the Daihatsu Midget, for example. This is called the Dhatsu B, and this is not so much a performance legend, this was their first passenger car. Daihatsu had been producing vehicles since the 30s anyway, but this one was around 1951-1952. It was a three-wheeler which helped with certain government-imposed costs as well when it came to running them, and it had a really fascinating little engine. It was rear-mounted, a 540cc four-stroke twin, and believe it or not, it's actually a very historically significant car for Japan because it was their first horizontally opposed engine that you can actually buy. Unfortunately, the costs were prohibitive for these, and they only ended up building about 300, so it is exceedingly rare, but it's a fascinating car for the history of Daihatsu, certainly an oddball one, and in a similar way to some of the other episodes which we've done, like the original Citroen 2CV, a very important stepping stone in the history of Daihatsu as a brand, and this is way before Toyota even got involved with them. The next one is one of my absolute favourite Daihatsu concept cars, and it's always the one which comes to mind first for me when I think of cool Daihatsus, the X021. It was initially shown at the Frankfurt Motor Show in 1991. They had involvement from Dome, as in like racing stuff, Dome, and it had some really cool but also very believable approaches to its build. And even calling it a concept car really does it a disservice because this thing was pretty much ready to go from a production sense. It had an aluminium space frame chassis, double wishbone suspension, even its specs were believable but also impressive, about 700 kilos, a 140 horsepower engine, so nothing insane in terms of manufacturing costs. The engine was mounted completely behind the front axle, so a front mid-engine approach. It just would have been a fantastic rival to the Mazda MX-5. The visuals are stunning on this car, and as it was shown over the forthcoming years and at different shows, they had a couple of different versions. There's the kind of bluish silver one, which most of the Google images will pop up with, but then they had more of an exposed chassis, which was later turned into another vehicle. I believe it was painted blue, if I recall correctly, and there was also a repaint to yellow at some point, but it's just such a gorgeous looking little car. Looks way more exotic than the Daihatsu has any right to, and of course they have some experience with this kind of stuff later on, like the Copen, but it's not exactly on the same level as this car. It's such a shame that it wasn't produced, and there's really no good reason aside from just cutting costs, I guess, from a financial perspective, that Daihatsu never built it. The next two vehicles are, I would imagine for many of you, going to be the two standouts. Aside from maybe the Group B car from earlier on, these are very, very cool little cars. The first one is actually Daihatsu's first ever race car, the P3 from 1966. It was a 1.3 litre twin cam 4-cylinder with about 100 or so horsepower. As I said, it was their first racing car and it actually had success. 5-speed manual with front engine rear-wheel drive. It won its very first event at Fuji in the P3 category, later won in class at Suzuka for the 12-hour event as well, and then this one was succeeded by the even cooler, and this was in the thumbnail, P5. And around 1967 and beyond, this was up to about 130, 140 or so horsepower, barely weighed 500 kilos, with a very similar approach, that twin cam, in this case twin carb engine. It got a podium finish at Suzuka, a class win at Fuji, and even around the time when Toyota took over Daihatsu in 1969, this thing was still racing. And even a little bit after that point, it achieved a second place finish in the 1,000 kilometers of Suzuka. Both the P3 and the P5 are, as I said, just undeniably really cool race cars, particularly this one with those very prototype-esque looks. Really cool exhaust. I love the fact that they're bright yellow, they're very in your face, and it has to be said, certainly for their class, very successful little cars. The next one is, funnily enough, very similar in a couple of ways and wildly different in others. The similarities end at it's mostly seen in yellow and also has about 130 horsepower, but the YRV Turbo is hardly anywhere near as cool. The reason why it's on the list is because if something like my Syrian Rally 2 is undervalued, this thing is on the ground. It's in the basement of being undervalued. It has a similar underpinning to the Syrian, but actually more power. The unfortunate thing is it's an auto, so it's not quite as quick and it's a bit heavier as well, but a 130 horsepower turbo aspirated YRV is just kind of really cool, especially when here in the UK you can pay like 500 quid to £1,000 for one of these things quite easily, and it's kind of a perfect little runabout. Don't expect any street cred, certainly for a bright yellow car with YRV 130 Turbo R written down the side, but as long as you don't care about what other people think of you, it's a deceptively good little thing, and if nothing else, it's a 130 horsepower turbo engine which you could take out and slap into something different. Speaking of their smaller stuff, which is very cool though, this one is definitely one of the best known here on the list out of the 10, but I would wager that most of the people who are aware of the car either come from the rally scene or more so from Gran Turismo. This is the one which made me fall in love with Daihatsu, and it's the one which made me buy my Syrian, because it was the closest thing I could get here in the UK, and it is of course the Storia Cross 4. When you see this car, it looks like absolute retirement home special, or as I call my little red one, the Jelly Bean. These are just completely unintimidating, soft looking little cars. They're kind of Kei Car-ish, but they look a little bit too wide. My version, the Rally 2 here in the UK, is already a pretty quick little car, 7.8 seconds to 60 from a naturally aspirated 110 horsepower 1.3 engine and weighs about 850 kilos. The Rally 2 has front wheel drive, and the Rally 4, which is a bit slower because it's heavier, is four wheel drive. This one though is a monster. Over in Japan, they didn't bother with a naturally aspirated 1.3, they gave it virtually half the size engine but with a turbo, a 713cc with 120 horsepower and twin limited slip diffs with four-wheel drive from the factory. What these were in very real terms rally base cars, finished in a boring dull white with steel wheels, no fancy visuals, and the reason for that is because these were not hot hatches. The whole purpose was rally teams would buy them, immediately put rally tyres and a livery on it and dominate their class. In the sub 1 litre category, these things are just absolute monsters with about 7-second 0 to 60 times, which might not sound that quick these days, but for one of these that is properly quick. And given how quick my version is, which is the non-turbo UK equivalent, I would love to get my hands on a Cross 4. There are a couple of them here in the UK, but they cost a lot more. But yeah, you can't really have a cool Daihatsu's list without having this one on there. Next up, I've chosen a vehicle which, as I often like to do, particularly when it comes to concept cars, it's cooler more in like a style perspective rather than being fast or having any kind of production intent. It's called the Dbone, which is an interesting name for this Daihatsu. It actually stands for Dynamic Bone, which doesn't really sound much better, but they're alluding to the fact that it's kind of an open skeleton of a vehicle, which makes a bit more sense then. It's a vehicle with no rain protection, so the interior is actually completely waterproof, which is a really cool idea. It has four-wheel drive with a 660cc 3-cylinder, so basically like what you'd expect from a little Copan or a Kei car, like a Move, etc. It was shown at the Geneva Motor Show, and it was kind of like an off-road, very toned-down Caterham Ariel Atom kind of thing, but with a bit more practicality. The sort a vehicle that you could live with, but also just suddenly go off-road into a ditch for no apparent reason, but not be too bothered about it. It's not, as I said, the kind of car which was ever necessarily going to reach production, and it certainly isn't going to blow anyone's mind, but it has some pretty cool little ideas, and for me personally, I really love the fact that they give it the waterproof interior. That's just a cool touch. The next car is one which simultaneously looks to their past and to the future. It's called the DN Compagno, and this is a reference to a vehicle which they produced back around the early 60s to around 1970 called the Compagno, or Companion. It was a tiny little car available in a few different forms, like a pickup and a saloon. This one, as you can see, clearly is a throwback. In fact, you can see the older car next to it at the show. I love these retro future kind of designs, combining the style and the kind of personality of a classic or retro car with modern advantages and efficiency and finding parts more easily, etc, etc. And that was exactly the point here. Another fun fact about the original Compagno is it was the first Daihatsu to bear the D emblem, which they're known for today. This modern version had a rather boring CVT gearbox, but it was a 1.2 litre petrol electric hybrid, which is pretty cool. The idea of having a really small hybrid isn't quite as often seen, especially around the time when you'd have also stuff like Priuses, which are modestly sized but not overly small. This would have been even smaller than that, kind of a budget hybrid, which I think is quite a cool idea, especially when it looks as retro-futuristic as this one does. And if none of these vehicles were wild enough for you, well, then this one should be. It's the Daihatsu TA-X80. Not the most catchy name, but look at this thing. What a wacky looking little car. You would never guess it was a Daihatsu, but not only does it have those crazy sliding doors, it's a two-seater vehicle, has more of a strict sports car approach, at least on the surface, and its engine choice is so weird. This is a 1 litre turbo. Doesn't sound that crazy for a Daihatsu, but what if I said it was a 1 litre turbo V6? I mean, talk about the tiniest pistons you've ever seen. That thing must sound very interesting, and it's only got about 120 horsepower in a vehicle which is barely bigger than the Daihatsu Sirion. This is less than 13 feet long, so it is a really, really small car with some great aerodynamics and really cool doors. It was shown off at the Tokyo Motor Show at the time, back in the late 80s, so as I opened the video with, it's not exactly the kind of brand where you would expect them to have wacky cars, the P3, the P5, the Group B Charade, but boy do they have some cool ones. So of course, if you enjoyed this episode and would like to check out the others, as I said, there is a link to that down below in the description. As I also mentioned, definitely add any down in the comments which you think I might have missed, or some other cool Daihatsu additions. I'll see you next time with another episode, and for now, thanks for watching.